It's wonderful to be here, and you have such a beautiful campus. It really is a treat to see it. So my book, Writing with Scissors, American Scrapbooks from the Civil War to the Harlem Renaissance, investigates what ordinary 19th century newspaper readers did with their reading. Unlike anyone you know, they felt overwhelmed with reading material. Newspapers had become extremely cheap, but the material in them seemed tantalizingly valuable if only one could save it so that it would be accessible again. And so tens of thousands of 19th century Americans of all races and classes made newspaper clipping scrapbooks. I've read hundreds of these in dozens of repositories over the past 10 years, and it's a fascinating realm of writing. It's barely been explored, so you graduate students out here, you have another topic to consider. By way of an overview, the range of scrapbook making, even of these newspaper clipping scrapbooks, is extraordinary. During the US Civil War, Northerners and Southerners made scrapbooks that shaped their sense of nation as they experienced it through the public press, saving poetry, news accounts, letters from regiments that were published in the paper, all sorts of things. And their sense of living through momentous times is what animates these scrapbooks. I'm just curious, did anyone here save the newspaper after 9/11? Okay, and if I asked this question in the States, I would get most of the room with their hands up. That same passion, the sense that you're living through a very special moment and it's reflected in the news and you're part of that news is something that continues with us. I'll bet some people are saving the news of Hurricane Sandy, for example. That same idea that this is, in my life, in the newspaper, and I'm inside it. And certainly everybody's now doing the equivalent of that on Facebook or Pinterest, sending pictures here and there. Again, part of the news that they're in, the public realm of print or its current equivalent. But other scrapbooks are more miscellaneous, a mix of obituaries, fun facts, news items. Fun facts columns, by the way, are a big deal in the late 19th century. Newspapers all think that they're basically column fillers, but people take them seriously as something that they really ought to know. This is important information. Or they might have tracked a collector's individual or idiosyncratic interests. So there were many scrapbooks of medical and scientific discoveries that were sometimes kept by professionals as a way of keeping track of their profession, of what was happening there. Newspapers were more up to date than the books were. And some newspapers even had special columns suggesting that something was either for the scrapbook or the scrapbook column. So you were likely to then, you were sort of being directed to go clip it out and put it in your scrapbook. And then I'll be talking more later about some more particular scrapbooks that African Americans and women's rights activists made. So all of these scrapbook makers clipped the papers and pasted clippings down, sometimes into books bought specially for the purpose, although these kinds of, the one on the top is more likely a children's scrapbook, very likely for pictures, but the one on the bottom was used during the Civil War by a Southern family. And so they might have bought some of these elaborate scrapbooks pre-made for the purpose, but, and another version of that is a scrapbook that Mark Twain invented that had pre-glued pages. So you would moisten them with a sponge like an old postage stamp and then slap your clipping onto it. He argues here that in his ad that this is a wonderful invention, not just for scrapbook making, but to save the profanity of this country. He's in the old style scrapbook at the top. The man is getting his feet in the glue and the cat is running through it all, and everything is, and he's managed to cut his trousers with his scissors, and he's cursing and there's profanity coming out of his mouth, and then tranquility reigns in using the new style Mark Twain scrapbook. So this joke of his scrapbook circulated all over. He took advantage of the newspaper's practice of what they called exchanges, where one newspaper would reprint material for free from other newspapers, and here he finally instead of having his work ripped off by one newspaper or another, actually got to ride on the circuit of recirculation to advertise his book. But most people did not buy special books for making scrapbooks. They often pasted into old books, into repurposed. I'm sorry, there's Twain with his scrapbook. They pasted into old books, often things that they had gotten for free from their congressman, like the Patent Office report from the government, which was circulated widely because, your congressman would think, oh, if I give my constituent this nice fat book, they'll really appreciate me. And then they have a nice fat book, and they slice out every other page and they fill it in with clippings, and then they have a lovely book that looks very substantial on the bookshelf. So that's one version. Here's the agricultural reports. Also, you can see the actual picture from the reports peeping out from the bottom of the last page that was used for clippings. And and people used all sorts of other things, old ledgers, and that causes a problem often with libraries that would sort of like to know what was in the ledger beforehand, and textbooks, catalogs. I have a couple of books of sermons that were repurposed as scrapbooks. You can see a little bit of tension there about what the contents are good. So people were privileging their own reading interests and tastes, and they were manifesting that with the attractions of a nice, substantially bound book, carrying these very ephemeral pieces of paper, these things that really, weren't meant to last. So, and at the same time they're destroying a book, in one sense, it's to take advantage of the prestige of a book. And those displaced contents are covered over with what they cared about, poems or household hints or news about storms or whatever it might be. So, in a sense, though, as I've hinted in terms of thinking about coverage of storms, and newspaper clipping scrapbooks were, in many ways, the ancestors of our web bookmarks and favorites lists, of Google, of blogging, more particularly. They're ways of both making a breadcrumb trail to find your way back through print, and also of sharing responses to the media. So making a collection of media that you then hand out again and makes its way out in various ways that we can talk about. So these newspaper clipping scrapbooks allowed readers to save, manage, and reprocess information. Thousands of people made scrapbooks, and those included statesmen such as Abraham Lincoln. Here's his scrapbook from the Lincoln he was as public speakers very often did this, because if they spoke extemporaneously, if they were famous enough and a reporter came and took down their speech, then the speech would be in the paper and they would then have a copy of it. Frederick Douglass kept scrapbooks too, although some may have been burned up in a fire, and these were documenting mentions of him in the paper for the most part. Others like writers like Mark Twain, of course, as we've seen, but also Stephen Leacock kept scrapbooks of his, but mostly of his speaking, not of, as far as I know, not of his writing. But writers like Horatio Alger and Jack London also kept scrapbooks because they were a way to save copies of material of theirs that had been in print. Remember, there are no Xerox machines, there's no carbon paper, there's a very cumbersome way of making copies of handwritten material, but if you have a printed copy of what was, appeared in the newspaper or magazine in your collection, then you have it's essentially what they used to call tear sheet in the magazine business. You have a better copy, a fair copy, more useful to you really than your foul matter manuscript, because you can mark on it if you want to revise it and put it back into circulation, as Mark Twain did with his writings. So important for writers. L.M. Montgomery, by the way, did keep a scrapbook, but it's a memorabilia scrapbook, so a different category from what we're talking about here. Actors such as Sarah Bernhardt kept scrapbooks too, a way of documenting ephemeral performances, so that things that otherwise disappear, there's some kind of record of. She wrote an autobiography, and it was sort of trashed for basically being drawn too heavily on her scrapbooks. But this list of celebrity scrapbook makers is simply to take advantage of your interest in stars. I'm sorry. Really more important is how people in positions of relative powerlessness what the Occupy Wall Street activists would call the 99%, did to use, how they used their scrapbooks to make a place for themselves and their communities by finding, sifting, analyzing, and recirculating the writing that mattered to them. So I want to begin with the example of one particular scrapbook maker, just so we can consider a bit about what her scrapbook making meant. Around 1870, Frances Smith began a scrapbook of newspaper clippings of remedies and recipes that any farm woman might want. She pasted down information in basically an unsorted torrent. There are cows next to curing scaly rashes in children, next to lightning rods, and an admired poem. And then there's a recommendation from Mr. John Hill of Hernico County, Virginia, who has some very reliable remedies for foot rot and scab in sheep. So when I read this scrapbook in a Nebraska archive, I assumed that Frances Smith was a farm woman saving useful information for her work raising her children and animals. But instead, I discovered she was an unmarried school teacher in a Mount Holyoke graduate living in the East when she started the scrapbook. And she only later married, moved west, and became the author Willa Cather's Aunt Frank. So her scrapbook then embodied her aspirations. It saved up articles she thought she might need in her future homesteading life, and it made them a good deal more portable than the stacks of newspapers that she'd combed to find them. So notice the space that she made for the very different life that she had to imagine herself into. Writing this scrapbook with scissors let her save provisions ahead to this future self by bringing the community of helpful commentators from Eastern newspapers into an imagined future where she would need to know about sheep diseases, provide herself with poems she otherwise might not see again, and to dignify her clippings with the prestige of a bound book. So we can think of the scrapbook as a portable reading device. So it's not surprising that scrapbooks were sometimes used as a metaphor for a life, a person's knowledge and reading of a lifetime. Visual representations of scrapbook makers often show children making the activity of children making scrapbooks. The making is shown as a child's activity, although as we've seen, adults were formidable scrapbook makers. While in this metaphor, the white-haired scrapbook reader is an aged person. I don't know how well you can see that, but it's a white-haired figure holding her scrapbook, of a very thick scrapbook representing the wisdom of a lifetime. Ordinary people's scrapbooks, like Frances Smith Cather's, open a window into the lives and thoughts of people who did not respond to their world with their own writing. As they saved printed matter and arranged it in ways that expressed their own ideas, they created value from their reading for themselves and their communities. So this private but widespread reworking of the mass-produced press in scrapbooks shows how national and world events entered into people's understanding and feelings. Now, in one sense, the scrapbooks are simply filing systems, but because the clippings were fixed into place, they've left us a record of how people read and grappled with what they read. So in saying that we look at newspaper reading of the 99%, though, I want to call attention to the ways that scrapbook makers used their scrapbooks for what we'd now call political organizing. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on scrapbooks made by two groups: African Americans, racemen, as they might have been called, concerned with African American history and political position, and women's rights activists. In very different ways, these scrapbooks show how readers, armed with scissors, used the press to articulate their concerns. We could say they were occupying the press. Among the hundreds of these scrapbooks I've read were the works of over a dozen 19th century African American scrapbook makers, and I'm going to discuss a few of them and how they used scrapbooks in what was essentially an act of spying. Sorry, this is the one I want. There we go. Before the Civil War, nearly all the white daily press assumed that they had no black readers. And after the Civil War, they mostly continued to imagine that as well, that they addressed an all-white audience. Then this is despite rising rates of black literacy in this period. So they reflected that assumption in their endorsements of lynching and of the suppression of the black vote at worst, and a patronizing tone about African Americans at best. After the war, a small black press did grow in importance, and eventually there were a few such weeklies that were distributed nationally. But the daily press, and with it the public sphere of print, was essentially white. Now, an important quality of the public sphere of print, as Habermas and others have laid it out, is that it enables anonymous, faceless encounters. Access to white newspapers and magazines brought black people otherwise unavailable information, which was enabled by their facelessness to the publisher. And there's a really wonderfully dramatic story of this in Frederick Douglass's writing, where he is able to silently and invisibly join the community of readers at a distance, fording a virtual river in a sense, to learn that others besides himself opposed slavery. So when he's still enslaved in the 1830s, Douglass hears the word abolition spoken by whites who are blaming abolitionists for slaves running away and attacking their masters. So he's, of course, very alert to find out what this means. He's very eager to learn more about this. But of course, he can't ask. The dictionary leads him in circles. It defines abolition as the act of abolishing. So finally, in a copy of the white newspaper, the Baltimore American, that he gets hold of, he learns the incendiary information denied me by the dictionary. So the newspaper, now this was a hostile pro-slavery newspaper, but it provided him with information that the people around him, his masters and their friends, don't want him to have. And he also learns that other people support his desire for freedom. So it connects him as well to abolitionists in the North, because the Southern newspapers published abolitionist writings in order to insult them. So when his mistress later is enraged to see him with a newspaper, she appropriately, really, responds to him with the fury of someone discovered in a plot by some dangerous spy. So this trope of black people reading the newspaper as spying, as clandestinely listening in on the white public sphere and gathering and conveying hidden information, is entirely apt, and it continues into the late 19th century and even 20th century press. So when post-emancipation African Americans read or spied on an often hostile white press, they remade it and critiqued it in their scrapbooks. They had other methods too, but I'll focus on scrapbooks. So I'm going to sample a few scrapbooks in this talk that exemplify three different uses of scrapbooks: presenting an analysis of the media using the language of juxtaposition, remaking of the meaning of the white press via written commentary, and saving black history, finally. So several black men whose work I've looked at were prodigious makers of scrapbooks. In one case, one created 150 very substantial scrapbooks. Another made almost 400 from the 1860s through the first decades of the 20th century. And these earlier scrapbook makers mainly clipped the white press for the reasons I've outlined before, and perhaps not just because there weren't dailies and there weren't as many black papers that lasted, but also probably, I have some evidence that they saved the entire paper of the black press rather than cutting it up, but that's not totally consistent. So, but the way that they critiqued the white press was using the language of juxtaposition, the placement of materials to articulate comparisons and contrasts. Charles Hunter of North Carolina, who was a black school principal involved in North Carolina politics, offers one example of this kind of juxtaposition. We saw his scrap here. We can see here he pasted his clippings onto old paper bags, which he then pasted into old roll books that he had for his work as a principal. And so it's very scrappy, really a democratic archive in the sense of, it took no money to make. And among other things, he pasted articles, in one case, comparing the outcomes of similar accusations brought against whites and blacks. So he has a pair of clippings. One is a black man lynched for after he's been accused of raping a white young woman. And right next to it, a story that happens a couple of months later, a white man released and freed and exonerated after being accused of raping a white girl. So he's making an explicit comparison. He's not writing a word about it, but he's articulately making that statement with scissors. He's telling stories using the language of juxtaposition. He and other black scrapbook makers also collected material on the moves in the post-Reconstruction era to suppress the black vote. And of course, this is very timely now, as this is happening, I don't know if you've been following the news in the US, but one of the strategies of the Republican Party has been specifically to suppress the black vote. But these were often scrapbook makers in the North who were following what was going on in the South with great attention and concern. So it's a sort of monitoring what's going on in the news, but also making a record. Scrapbook makers also occasionally use direct verbal commentary that lets us hear the voice of a black person responding to the noise of the white press and supplying a corrective. So John Wesley Cromwell, who was an editor, writer, and amateur historian in Washington, D.C., kept a large scrapbook in the 1890s. He had been a newspaper editor, and he was again, but the 90s was a period when he was not editing a newspaper, and this, in some sense, perhaps filled in for that. He has occasional written comments, and they amplify and they change the direction of white-dominated stories. So one instance has him speaking back to the press in a very personal, powerful way. So I want to go into it a little bit. He collected an 1897 obituary for Thomas Gorsuch of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, from a white paper. Now, Gorsuch, so the obituary points out that Gorsuch witnessed the death of his own father, Colonel Edward Gorsuch of Baltimore, in the 1851 Christiania, Pennsylvania fugitive slave riot. So this was an uprising of escaped slaves who had moved to Pennsylvania, and but in this post-Reconstruction world of the white newspaper, there's tremendous sentimentality about slavery, and it's all regarded as it was a kindly system. There's a sort of collective amnesia on the part of many whites about what the pre-war, the antebellum war was like. So the article seems sympathetic to the slaveholding colonel. It explains that when he tried to recapture an alleged runaway of his, the ex-slaves fought back, and those captured were tried for treason, but two of them were excused from trial on plea of ill health. The article then notes that the two who were excused from trial lived to be 91 and 94. So it's suggesting that trickster black prisoners faked illness and hoodwinked lenient whites to escape punishment. So it's part of that same sentimental narrative. But Cromwell annotates it. You can see in there, he'll make it a little bigger, but you still can't read it. He annotates this article, and he says, he sort of ignores the whole direction of it, but he says, "I have heard my father frequently refer to this trial to confirm his belief in the power of prayer. Elder Nazare, at a religious service prior to the trial, prayed that those testifying against the accused might confuse one another in their testimonies. It happened as he prayed. The defendants were acquitted." J.W. Cromwell. His annotation changes the clipping. Instead of it playing out post-bellum white sentimentality about a son's loss of his slave-holding father 40 years earlier, it becomes the story of transmission of history and faith between an ex-slave father and his son. Cromwell rereads the story in the white press and turns it into a story of triumphing, of black people triumphing through godly power. So his scrapbook doesn't just embellish the white press with his marginalia, but it supplements it with African American knowledge and experience, and it resituates that information, and it forces it to tell another story. Scrapbooks tell many other stories as well. I'll turn finally to William Henry Dorsey, who was an artist and founding member of Philadelphia's American Negro Historical Society, an avid collector of many different things. And he made nearly 400 scrapbooks, mostly on black life. One small 50-page scrapbook named Colored Centenarians reveals a great deal about the power of writing with scissors. It consists of over 200 newspaper accounts, obituaries, and other items about black people that who were said to be over 100 years old, that he clipped in the course of about 40 years. So Dorsey cut items out of one newspaper context where each centenarian is written up as an isolated curiosity, and he pasted them into the new context of his scrapbook. It leads off with this 4-line clipping, which says, "Old Katie Jackson, a colored woman over 100 years old, died at Pottstown last Saturday. She saw General Washington in the year 1790 when on his way to suppress the whiskey insurrection." And he writes under it, "The above was my great-grandmother on my mother's side, William Henry Dorsey." And this is the first page of the scrapbook, and he puts a little frame around the item. And I think one of the interesting things here is that consider that he's not then turning this into a family scrapbook. None of his scrapbooks are family scrapbooks. He doesn't say, "Oh, and let me tell you about my sister, my cousins as well." He says, no, he's placing this at the head of a long line of black centenarians. And he's using that to tell a different story of American history, of U.S. history. Many of his subjects lived through the country's founding as a slave nation, and then either individually gained freedom or were emancipated during, following the Civil War. But the individual news items, so putting these all together creates a whole different story. So even though the stories are written by people who are often careless or patronizing, they're mostly white reporters, and they're not signed, so we don't really know. And there were a couple of black reporters in Philadelphia. Some of them might be by them. But he resituates this narrative to so that United States history is embodied through the life of African Americans. His book spotlights the very different experiences of white and black in relation to the founding of the country. So one clipping, for example, a very brief obituary of Lizzie Gray, notes that she was taken from Africa during the American Revolution and spent the war on a British ship. And the reporter doesn't remark on the contradiction of someone's slavery beginning in the freedom of the country. And she was released from British captivity into American slavery, into US slavery. Dorsey's language of juxtaposition, all of these different clippings that he put together on these pages of what had been a government report, provides that irony by setting stories of black people participating in the fight for the country's freedom next to stories like Lizzie Gray's and next to stories of people owned by the founding fathers like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, who are sometimes the same enslaved people fighting for the freedom of the country. So Dorsey created this black history out of the hostile white press. Women's rights workers had a similar task. There were suffragist and women's rights papers, but none of them were dailies. So the women's rights activists had to pay attention to the mainstream daily press, which was often hostile to them. And I'm not going to distinguish, obviously women's rights activism runs over many, many decades, and for our purposes today, I'm not going to be breaking that down in terms of the historical differences there, but that we can talk about that later if you like. These activist scrapbooks that I've looked at focused on their own work in the women's rights and suffrage movement, but they did so using the public materials of the press. And like the African American scrapbook makers, they used their scrapbooks to critique the mainstream press. Women's rights activists used accounts in the public press to document their own lives, so they're in some ways more individually focused in this case. But they also, along the way, analyzed the coverage and strategized about what to do with it. So from the earliest years of the women's rights movement in the US, activists understood how important it was to address and influence public opinion. They read and clipped newspapers to follow their press coverage. Now, speaking in public to audiences was not considered genteel, especially early on in the women's rights movement, and speaking for pay was also a bit dubious. So there's a lot of disapproval of their public speaking that they're countering, that they encounter in the press, and they have to manage it in various ways. So the group of scrapbooks, so they're also claiming to act in the public realm as well. The scrapbooks I looked at were made largely by middle-class women who were active in public writing and speaking for a variety of reforms, and their activism left them vulnerable to being criticized as unwomanly. So as they created their public personas and staked out public space as writers and speakers, they presented their womanly domestic credentials so they could be listened to and taken seriously. Sometimes that went really over the top. People would knit in public. Women would knit in public so that they would look domestic, while they were at their conventions. And in their homes, they're bringing home the news of their work in public, but they do it in the form sometimes of a very elegant-looking scrapbook. So even as they're monitoring their work in the public press, and are also kind of telling their families about what they're doing. So sometimes they mark that affiliation with the domestic through the form of their scrapbooks. Clara Barton, for example, the Civil War nurse who also raised money for Civil War nursing, through her articles and writings, received a gift in 1864 of a scrapbook specially for her clippings. She says she's pleased to receive a beautiful scrapbook designed for my own articles. And now she had kept scrapbooks before, so I've given you just the first page, which has, you can't make it out in the dim light here, but it's got a very nice ornamented, her letters are very ornamented there. The cover itself is also quite pretty, but it didn't come out very well in the photograph, so I'm not showing that. But she had been keeping scrapbooks for years as a teacher. Scrapbook keeping was part of pedagogical practice, so it was advocated for, all teachers were advised to do it. And here's her old scrapbook, where clippings cover over an old copybook, where somebody has copied out the word, is practicing handwriting. But the special gift of the scrapbook celebrating her own writing was important to her. It's a beautiful article, and I prize it much, she says again in her diary. So the scrapbooks of women working for reform reveal them also in the process of negotiating, of finding strategies. So another angle that they're at is paying attention to reception. How were their works and their activities written about in the press? And here's an example of that comes through the Boston writer and women's rights pioneer Caroline Healy Dahl, who exemplifies how scrapbook making connected public speaking, newspaper reading, and the newspaper reader's awareness of other readers. Her scrapbook, she's, by the way, a prodigious diarist. She kept a diary for, 70 years or so. And it's from but she kept a scrapbook more briefly, and it's from the period when she began speaking in public. And it shows her making her way into the public realm using the public materials that reflect her new place in venues like the lecture platform. She made her first speech in 1855 at the Women's Rights Convention in Boston, speaking about Massachusetts laws. And she's very excited about this talk. She clips every article she can find on it, evidently, and she only clips the part of the article that concern her speech, though. She kind of cuts off everybody else. So she's not documenting the movement, she's documenting herself within the movement. And she's also concerned with her own career as a public speaker. She needed to earn money. Her husband had had a nervous breakdown and had lost his pulpit. He was a minister, and he'd left for India, and he remained there for most of his life, leaving her to raise their 2 children on her own. She was essentially a single mother. So the question of how to make money preoccupied her. She attended a lecture by her friend, James Freeman Clark, and her diary shows her, she's actually kind of, this was a pretty bad lecture, but he made money from it. So how much did he make? Well, she's sort of interested, she finds out, and she wonders if she too could lecture for money. The bar's that low, not a problem. So with her success at the convention behind her, and she also copied out in her diary all the praise she received for her speech, she's ready to go with her talk. So she gets a notice of her talk into the paper, and her diary shows a friend bringing this 1-paragraph notice of her first paid lecture from the Boston Evening Traveler, and she says, "It did not please me. I scribbled a little note which I hope the editor will print." Dal was disturbed at the direction of the note. She thought the Traveler editors had mischaracterized her position in a way that was going to cost her lecture engagements. So the scrapbook where she saves in this one paragraph objectionable notice and her 8-paragraph little note reply addressing the slant as well as the content of the writing, she pulls apart its assumptions as carefully as a media scholar, really. Her reply takes the newspaper editors to task, even for the wording of the notice's headline, which she assumes is meant as a slur. So just one paragraph from her note reads, "Lecture by a female." Female what? Parrot, popinjay, or monkey? The phrase does not hurt me on my own account, but I confess I am weary of this popular coarseness. I suppose you will acknowledge, Mr. Editors, that there are women who feel it their duty to address public audiences. If so, why add to the painful notoriety which circumstances at present ensure them? If, after a brilliant political dinner, you were to see this caption, "Fine speech by a male," what should you think? That your compositor had gone crazy, I am sure. Very truly yours, Caroline H. Dow. Once her letter was published, she mailed out copies of the newspaper containing it, presumably sending them, though not the original notice, to other sources of lecturing engagements. And she also pasted it into her scrapbook. So in one sense, Dow simply interprets the Traveler article, but her scrapbook preserves a record of her awareness of others reading this article, and also the need to counteract a reading she believes will damage hers. There's a couple of layers running in there. She imagines an uncritical reader who will not recognize the charged political implications of the Traveler's dismissive and distressing editorial notice, and so she writes this letter. She heightens the reader's attention to the editor's hostile intent by highlighting and critiquing their phrasing, while countering damaging statements. So it's a very complex record of reception, not just a souvenir announcement of the paid lecture, but it preserves and reinforces her recognition of the need to read over the shoulders of other readers, to be aware of how other readers will receive accounts of her performance, and to speak back to those perceptions. How are we doing for time? Okay. All right, then I'm going to skip over Elizabeth Boynton Harbert, who also critiqued the press in her scrapbooks and sort of corresponded with other suffragists about what bad notices in the press meant, and kind of encouraged each other by saying, look, it's a good thing if you get dismissive coverage, because it's a sign that our opposers do not dare to report it correctly. So there's a sense of, the newspaper is something you pay attention to for a variety of reasons. So cutting and pasting the proliferating cheap press, scrapbook makers documented their feelings about and reactions to momentous public events mediated through the newspapers. African Americans and women's rights activists collected, concentrated, and critiqued accounts from a press they did not control or own to create what one black journalist called unwritten histories in books they wrote with scissors. The 19th century understandings of remixing and recirculation, their attentiveness to reception, appear when we open up the democratic archive that they created with their scrapbooks. Thank you. So I hope people are full of questions, and I would love to talk more about them, about whatever you have to say, whatever you notice in all of this. Yes, Caroline.
Do you see a change over time in the use of them? Your book goes right up to, what's the rest of the title? From the Civil War to?
The Harlem Renaissance.
Okay. So how do they change over time? Do you see?
Well, they do. Yeah, partly there's greater professionalization in some of them. So the kinds of people like Abraham Lincoln, statesmen, public lecturers, public writers, or very accomplished writers, no longer, by and large, make personal scrapbooks by, say, the 20s. They might make them, what they do is commission clipping services which would, for a fee, go through each day's paper and tell you, and send you a pile of clippings showing where you had appeared in the press, or where your book had appeared, or where your writings had appeared. Those were mainly used for commercial purposes. That is, if you were a furniture manufacturer, then and then you would get notices of a new school going up, and you could go pitch them for furniture. But if you've used archives at all, archival sources from the early 20th century, well, all of the 20th century, you may have seen clippings that have blue pencil circling on them, and those are usually clipping service products. So there's a kind of professionalization, and then people are less likely to sometimes they do put them in scrapbooks, but they're less likely to do that. Libraries stop making scrapbooks. They have the wonderful high-tech invention of the vertical file, which is what we now call a filing cabinet, but that's a novelty then. So some of the functions of scrapbooks are taken over by other technologies. But people do continue to make scrapbooks of, if they're not going to hire a clipping service, of their own work, or again, of wars. You find World War I, World War II scrapbooks. The Harlem Renaissance is a specific reference to another African-American scrapbook maker, Ellis Alexander Gumby, whose scrapbooks are at Columbia, and he made, again, over 100 scrapbooks, very elaborate, beautifully made, with a kind of attention and nod back. He gives his props to older scrapbook makers, in a sense. He's really doing, in some ways, meta scrapbook making. He's in another realm. Yeah. And suffragists, too, were hiring clipping services or commissioning or making their own clipping services, and again, doing this on a more professional level. Yeah. You? Yes?
I have a question about audience. You mentioned that Dorsey didn't make family scrapbooks, but I noticed that Dorsey and Cromwell both signed their commentaries.
Yeah.
What are you imagining as reading their commentary?
Well, Dorsey had what he called Dorsey's Museum in his home. He lived in a row house in Philadelphia. He had some money. His father was a caterer, which was kind of the upper crust of black society, and had bought property. And he kept a room or two of his collections. He collected African-American art and African art and books. He was a bibliophile, and his rows of scrapbooks. And he had them on display for people to come look. And there are reports about it in the black press, mainly, of visitors coming to see him. He doesn't usually sign things in the scrapbook. That seems like a passionate moment for him. And the same with Cromwell. I mean, that's also a curious moment. And I'm not sure how Cromwell shared his scrapbooks, although there do seem to be some other notations like that. Generally, people don't write in these newspaper scrapbooks. Authors might correct typos or have other annotations like that, where if they're going to reprint, they're thinking ahead. If I reprint it, what else might I want to add to this? But there's often a sense that a scrapbook is a personal book. They don't usually have signatures in the front, so that they're not, which suggests to me that they're not going to go out of the house. I mean, if you're going to lend a book, what do you usually do to it? You write your name in the front, right? So that Cromwell has other notations that look like they might have been, he was allowing other people to see it, and by what method, I don't know. Yeah. Who else? Other questions, other thoughts, other directions to hear more on? Yes, in the back, all the way. Oh, okay, in the green.
Do you know anything about Ellen Montgomery's scrapbooks or memorabilia?
If I can get online, I could show it to you, but there's this website of it. There are actually a couple of websites that reference it. I took a quick look. I had been under the impression that she had scrapbooks of her own writings in PEI. I know that the repository there has some of her works, but some of those materials, some scrapbooks of hers, but the ones that I saw online are essentially memorabilia scrapbooks possibly from before her success as a writer. There's a whole other strain of scrapbook making that I'm not really engaging in this book because it's a whole separate issue. and that is memorabilia scrapbooks. And those become very popular in the 90s, a little popular in the 80s, very popular among people who go away to school, both men and women at boarding school or college. It's a way of bridging their earlier and later life, I think, or marking this. They're experiencing a profusion of print materials that they can play with. So they'll have dance programs and cards from games and pennants and things like that, as well as newspaper clippings that talk about their own activities. There are many scrapbooks of this sort, and you might even have some of those in the university archives here, possibly. Many colleges and universities do have such items. So the ones that I've seen of Montgomery's are that sort. Yes, you have something on that?
Yeah, hers were just published.
Oh, they were?
They often have ideas for her short stories
Oh, they do?
in them. So stories in the newspaper, she did a lot of newspaper clippings,
Uh-huh.
and they were used as inspiration for stories. So there's recent work that's looked at the scrapbooks and looked at her stories. And
Oh, I would love to see this. I didn't know about it.
that's Benjamin Lefebvre.
Say again?
Benjamin Lefebvre has done work on.
Okay, I will have to get the reference later. But yeah, that's another use that authors make of scrapbooks, of newspaper clippings. So Charles Reade, the British author, for example, writes a letter thanking the London Times for supplying him with all of this material for his writing that he's clipped and written stories from. So that idea that, and there are some of the suffragist writers also, who were also short story writers, Lily Devereux Blake, for example, clips articles about male violence and then makes it, uses those as references in her stories also. So that idea too, especially in the late 19th century, with the idea, with the sense that there's a huge world of mayhem and horrible things going on out there, and maybe you'll want that realistic backing in your own work shows up. So I'd like to, this is exciting. I have to go look for this. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. There was a man in the back earlier.
Oh, yeah. I just listening to and watching some of the pictures. It kind of puts me in mind of hypertext.
Yes.
Sort of what some of the goals of hypertext have been over the years. And what I'm especially interested in is using the juxtaposition as a rhetorical device.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not there's a discernible, that you've noted in your study of this, discernible vocabulary, that sort of typology that captures the rhetorical relationships that one can use, and essentially make the creation of these things or utilize it as a writing device. Because I think a fair amount of research increasingly, still under some dispute, is that the writing patterns of our students is changing over time.
Yeah.
And that a new form of writing is essentially a decoupage or bringing things together in a structured relationship to make some kind of argument. So my question is there a typology, or what could one be created that could be usefully employed in this? Have you noticed?
Wow, that's a tall order. Most scrapbook makers do not write about their scrapbook making, so there isn't a place where they're articulating that. On the other hand, there's a great deal there's a whole corpus of articles and books recommending scrapbook making and talking about its virtues and usefulnesses, and that then, that are published and that circulate. Whether they, we don't know exactly how they reflect actual scrapbook making. And there are only a few places where somebody says, and by the way, if you line these things up, you can see something from that. And those, actually, there are two versions of that in Civil War scrapbook making, where both Southern and Northern, where people talk about the propaganda in the newspaper. And if you take the stories from one day and then the next day, put them, which are, declaring victories for your side and how wonderfully everything is going, and then if you see what comes out the following day, where clearly all of that was untrue, only by putting them side by side will you see that. Otherwise, the current day's newspaper kind of displaces the past, and it becomes today's newspaper on the top of the stack. So in that case, juxtaposition is a method for detecting propaganda and lies. So there's that idea that is articulated, but it's all scattered. Nobody's putting all of that together, but it would be interesting to see. I mean, because I think you're right. Our current ways of thinking are very much informed by this. I mean, Pinterest, the idea of making just a bulletin board of your favorite, of pictures that you want to send around, of clustering things as a way of speaking, or even Jonathan Stewart, putting two clips up in contrast and saying, "See, look what hypocrisy they reveal," or something like that. I don't know if you all watch his show, but it's that idea of comparing, of just placing side by side as making a rhetorical claim. It's really interesting, worth thinking more about. Let's see, you had your hand up. What? Okay, the last question.
I'll try to be quick, but your talk made me think about a lot of things, and I'm looking forward very much to reading the book.
Great.
I'm a romanticist, so I know more about commonplace books
Yes.
probably than about scrapbooks. And what strikes me about the scrapbooks that you've shown us is the extent to which provenance is scissored out of the clippings. They don't give the header or the date line. And so there's this reassemblage of materials that lends itself to the construction really of a new composite subjectivity, which is quite different from the commonplace book. But as you were speaking, it made me think about, and maybe this is completely out of left field, but Emily Dickinson's fascicles, and the way in which she actually has to distance her own writings and deny them provenance and then reassemble them to make a composite subjectivity that actually has a very different kind of origin point. There's a sending out and then bringing back. So I wonder, I guess, if you have any comments about her practice, particularly vis-a-vis Civil War experience and poetics and the kind of subjectivity. I don't know, does that make any sense that how that might differ from or inform this?
Well, let me pick up on a couple things in what you're saying. One is the question of provenance, which is and is not scissored out. Scrapbook makers are very individual. Provenance meaning, what newspaper it came from, when it was written. Dorsey, for example, is pretty scrupulous about always notating that. But other people are trying to make a book-like object. They're trying to make their own version of an anthology. And then those people, especially with poetry, but with all sorts of other things, snip off that information. Newspapers themselves were not very scrupulous about keeping authors' names attached to anything when they reprinted. So there's all of that. Composite subjectivity. I don't know, I've been thinking of it more in relation to the sort of material object of the book that's created. And it is, though, saying this is my book and all of these thoughts are somehow like me in a way that a commonplace book also does. A commonplace book is an earlier practice that coexists and continues on and still exists now of copying out passages by hand. There's also a larger or a more pointed sense of one's own self entering into it. After all, your arm is the thing. You enter into the body of the person who wrote it by copying it. So there's a good deal of discussion about that, how either memorizing it or copying it will make that quote yours. Bright passages that strike your mind, as they say. So that subjectivity is something that you have created out of bits and pieces, and those all enter into you. And into your writing, as somebody, if you read Thoreau's Walden, for example, you may have been struck by, as my students sometimes are, by how many, why is this guy quoting so much? What's going on here? So there is that sense of the subjectivity created by other people's writing through that. Dickinson was very much involved with the ephemera of the press and with the practices of things like scrapbook making. We don't know if she made a scrapbook, but she did clip the paper, and she does have little clippings. She writes poems and fragments on the backs of ads and on the backs of bits of newspapers. So there is that sense also of negotiating with the press. I'm not sure if that quite gets to what you were saying, but I want to think more about that question. So, is that it, Ben? Okay.
I think
I know some people need to get to classes, so thank you all for coming. Please join me in thanking Ellen for passing the
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much.